Shalom and greetings, family. This is class 1 of the master's class of the true end of the age prophecy according to Yeshua. Now, I'm sure we've all heard stories, fables, and tall tales of the end of this age, Armageddon, the apocalypse. Well, today we will begin the study and process of sorting out truth from fiction. We will accomplish this by utilizing the scripture and secular histories, the scripture and secular history, revealing not just knowing but understanding. Scripture allows for the scripture and secular history to be in harmony. We will accomplish this. Let us begin examining what we've been told, perception. So what we've been told, the perception about the end of the age prophecy. And grow from just knowing to understanding what the scripture actually shares, reality. The reality of what the scripture actually shares, and compare the two. Now, before we move forward, it is of paramount importance we grow from just knowing to understanding perception and reality, and apply the understanding of the definitions of these words in all the information that we will be receiving, that will be shared. So first, let us grow from just knowing to understanding what we've been told, or perception, what we've been told, the perception. Perceptions are by definition observations, concepts, and mental images. But on top of that, get this, they can be and often are different for each person because they're subjective. Perceptions are subjective, so the observations, concepts, and mental images can and often are different for each person. And in addition to that, can be and often are established without unbiased data and or evidence. So again, the observations, concepts, and mental images are just your own. They're not established with other people's observations, concepts, and mental images to have an unbiased data point and unbiased evidence. Sadly, because of this, opportunistic groups, religion, and political affiliations often influence and or manipulate perceptions, observations, concepts, and mental images. They do this by supplying their own subjective, their own personal data and or evidence, which again is not indiscriminate. They do this to support and carry out their objectives to influence and manipulate. So that's the perceptions that's what perception is. And so what we've been told are the perceptions, okay? So lastly, let us go from knowing to understanding what the scripture actually shares. Reality. The reality of what the scripture actually shares, not what just someone's telling us, but as we go through and examine and study what the reality of what the scripture is telling us. So, reality, by definition, presents to us only validated, indiscriminate, unbiased data that exists necessarily, unavoidably, inescapably, inevitably. It's the reality. It's inevitable. This reality decreases corrupt opportunities for influencing and or manipulation by groups, religion, and political affiliations with their own subjective, not the reality, but with their own subjective personal data and or evidence. Now, this is important. We're digging in a little bit here because this really sets the stage from being able to see what we've been told to perception, those tall tales and fables, versus the reality of what Scripture is saying. This is really what it boils down to, perception and reality. So when perception and reality are both applied, and they should be, in analyzing and reasoning of anything, they should establish guardrails for evaluating to be solely on the merits. Perception and reality neutralize one another. On one end of the spectrum, perception allows for philosophical subjectivity, while on the other end of the spectrum, reality only considers validated, indiscriminate, unbiased data. So they basically neutralize each other, which then allows for the evaluation to be solely on the merits. Okay? It is of paramount importance that when perception plays a factor in our decision process of what people are telling us, that's perception, or what we just see. So it's important, it's of paramount importance that when perception plays a factor in our decision process, that it is always balanced with reality, allowing for the issue at hand to stand on its merits. You're encouraged to view the message, the inevitable, the perception and the reality of the inevitable on his servant's website. We did a whole message on this thing, but I need to set the stage for what we're about to do, so we just did a quick synopsis on it. But you're encouraged to view that whole message, and it goes into great detail about perception and reality. Now, it is of the utmost importance that we keep perception and reality front of mind as we continue this study. So that's why we dug in. Let's keep that front of mind. What we've been told, the perception, and the reality, what Scripture is actually sharing. So let's keep that front of mind as we continue this study. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay, so we'll move forward. So now let us actually begin now that we've set the groundwork. Our point of departure will be examining what the Messiah, Yeshua, had to say about the end of this age. So get this. Already, we're using a point of departure different from, I'd say, 90% of the rest of the world. We're not going to the book of Revelation. Our point of departure will be examining what the Messiah, Yeshua, had to say about the end of this age, allowing us to connect what Yeshua, the Messiah, shares with other scriptures that address the end of the age prophecy to validate one another. Everything should be able to corroborate and validate itself. That's a principle, that's a point the Scripture says, by out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let all things be established. So everything should be able to validate one another. The Scripture shares about the end of the age activity in both the Old and New Testament. So the Scripture talks about it in the Old and New Testament. Scripture reveals the Messiah, Yeshua, addressed this issue directly in the New Testament's last covenant. There are 3 accounts given by Yeshua, the Messiah, addressing the end of the age prophecy. So again, Scripture reveals to us, and this is what we're digging into, that Yeshua addressed the end of the age prophecy directly in 3 accounts. One account of the end of the age prophecy given by the Messiah, Yeshua, is in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21. Another account is given in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, and a third account in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24. Now, understanding what Yeshua shares in these 3 Gospels is of great value. Yeshua, shares with us 3 different vantage points, okay? In these 3 Gospels, Yeshua shares 3 different vantage points, each Gospel addressing a particular audience. each gospel addressing a particular audience. So, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, Yeshua shares with the Israelites and his disciples. So, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, Yeshua shares with the Israelites and his disciples the first vantage point, specifically addressing the Israelites and what they needed to prepare for in the near future. Okay? That's the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, Yeshua shares with the disciples, specific disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, he's only sharing with these four, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. The second vantage point of what the believers, disciples of those days, needed to prepare for during the first phase of the end of the age prophecy. The end of the age prophecy really is going to come, and you're going to see this in two phases, that first phase and then this last phase. So the Gospel of Mark chapter 13 deals with the second vantage point to just those four disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and it's dealing with the first phase of the end of the age prophecy, what they needed to prepare for. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, Yeshua shares with all of just the disciples, not the Israelites, just the disciples, the third vantage point of what the believers, the disciples of today, the last days, should be preparing for during this last phase of the end of the age prophecy. That first phase and then the last phase. Okay? Those are the three accounts Yeshua shares addressing the end of the age prophecy. Now, these three different vantage points are to three different audiences, as we just shared, and address, as we just shared, three different time periods. Okay? Now, understanding Scripture and validating it with Scripture allows us to build on our understanding and is always our objective and purpose. Remembering to always compare what we've been told, the perception, we said keep this front of mind, against what the Scripture actually shares, the reality. Now, we've discussed in previous writings and studies and classes the significance of numbers in the Scripture. Numbers mean things in the Scripture. So our understanding and validating of numbers done in previous writings and studies and classes will allow us to further build on our understanding of the end of the age prophecy. We keep these things in our tool belts, and we pull them out when we need them. So what we'll do is we'll quickly review what we have in our tool belt about the number 3. As we've called out, the Messiah addresses the end of the age prophecy in 3 of the 4 Gospels. He only did it in 3 of the 4 Gospels. From previous writings and studies and classes, we understand that the number 3 in Scripture means and identifies spiritual completion. Spiritual completion. In each of these 3 Gospels, for everyone seeking and humbling themselves to Elohim, Yeshua shares Elohim has provided what they should prepare for in order to receive a positive judgment. In each of the 3 Gospels, Yeshua shares what Elohim has told them that they needed and has provided for what they should prepare for to receive a positive judgment. Because it's talking about the end of the age. At the end of the age prophecy, at the end, there's only 2 things that's going to happen. You're going to receive a judgment in your favor, or there's going to be a judgment against you. That's all. We've talked about Elohim's grace and mercy in other studies, and again, I'll just elaborate on it here. Elohim's grace and mercy exists up into judgment time. There's grace and mercy up to judgment time. But once judgment hits, there's judgment. The end of the age is a judgment, and there's either going to be judgment in your favor or judgment against you. So all those humbling themselves to Elohim, Yeshua shares Elohim has provided what they should prepare for to receive a positive judgment in each of those three Gospels. Of the three Gospels, Luke, then Mark, and then lastly Matthew, this is the actual order regarding Yeshua's sharing of the true end of the age prophecy. So, yeah, the Gospels are listed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but when he's talking about the end of the age prophecy, the first one prophecy he gives is in the Gospel of Luke. The second vantage point he gives is in the Gospel of Mark, as we pointed out, and then the last is in the Gospel of Matthew 24. Okay, this is the actual order of the true end of the age prophecy. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, the last of the three Gospels, the third shared by Yeshua of the true end of the age prophecy, will be our primary gospel. And the reason being is because it focuses on the last phase of the end of the age prophecy. Okay? We shared that these are three different vantage points to three different audiences and three different time periods. So the Gospel of Matthew is dealing with the last phase of the end of the age prophecy, and that is going to be our primary gospel that we're going to use, that Yeshua shared about the end of the age prophecy. There's a lot of information in the other two. If you have questions, we can talk about that offline, because I've done a detailed study on all of them, but this is probably the most relevant right now because of all the things that are going on in the world at this point in time. So we want to get right to the chase, get right to the point on what Yeshua shared about this last phase of the end of the age prophecy. Okay? Everybody good? Okay? Second here. Okay. Okay. So, okay, so that there is no confusion about the purpose or intent of this class, so that we don't have any confusion about why we're doing this class. It is not intended to try and discover or determine the exact date or time of when Yeshua will return. That's not the purpose of this class. Nor is it to definitively state the when or who regarding the abomination of desolation or the son of perdition. That's not the purpose of this class. The purpose and intent of this class is to understand that as we grow from just knowing to understanding what Yeshua shared regarding the end of the age, as well as other scriptures have shared about regarding the end of this age, that it reveals when Yeshua will return within a reasonable time frame. So the purpose of this class, the intent of this class, is to allow Scripture to share with us as we grow from just knowing to understanding Scripture, that it will reveal, as we understand it and as we see and we observe the things that are going on around us, it reveals when Yeshua will return within a reasonable time frame. That's the purpose of this class. Understanding, Elohim would not have us to be unaware as to when he will execute his judgment. Understanding this, Elohim doesn't want us to be unaware, not knowing, like, oh, we don't know. He doesn't want that. And Scripture supports this. Scripture supports this in the Old Testament / covenant numerous times. In the book of Yasser, chapter 5, a corroborating and more detailed account of Genesis chapter 6, Elohim had Noah and Methuselah, two people, to share with everyone living at the time. The time frame they had to turn from their wickedness and unrighteousness. He had Noah and Methuselah to go and tell them, like, okay, you got a time frame to turn from your wickedness and unrighteousness, and that was the 120 years we read about, before his judgment would come. They weren't caught off guard. They weren't like, oh, where did this come from? Elohim told them through Noah and Methuselah exactly, within a real reasonable amount of time, when the judgment was going to come. And remember, we said grace and mercy is extended to all up until judgment. Another quick example in the book of Exodus. Elohim had Moses share with all that were in Pharaoh's court exactly when the final judgment would come upon Egypt. It didn't come upon them unaware. Everyone knew. And only those, though, with the blood of the Lamb on their doorposts were saved. These are a couple of examples, just a couple of examples. And during this study, we'll reveal another example of Elohim sharing through Yeshua a warning. We'll reveal all that heeded. So this warning Yeshua that Yeshua shared will reveal all that heeded Yeshua's instructions were spared Elohim's judgment. He does not want us to be unaware. So the perception, what we've been told about, well, no one knows when he's coming. Yes, that's not absolutely true. That's not absolutely true. I'm going to give a quick example. It says that no man knows the day or the hour, but it doesn't say that man won't know the week or the month or the year. No one knows the day or the hour. So the analogy I'll give you is it's like a farmer that grows fruit. He has plum trees. He can't tell you exactly the day or the time that plum is going to be ripe. But again, as he watches and he observes and he sees things, he can tell you in a reasonable amount of time when that plum is going to be ripe. So again, the perception is that we just are clueless. We don't have a clue as to when the end of the age is coming. That is not true. Scripture does not support that. There are several examples of Elohim telling his followers, his believers, exactly when he is going to pass judgment. Now, let's begin our thorough examination of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, that third gospel that Yeshua shared on the true end of the age prophecy. We're going to begin a thorough examination of this so that we'll grow from just knowing to understanding. In the very first verse of the Gospel of Matthew, it gives us insight into the mindset of the time. It gives us insight into the mindset of what people were thinking. And interestingly enough, the Messiah was addressing the disciples and men just like us today, that were and are still enamored, captivated with the temporal things of this world. At that point, then, it was the buildings of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. Not much has changed today except locations and the names. So let us read the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, and verse 1. It reads, "And Yeshua went out and departed." Yeshua went out. These words that are highlighted, I want you to really focus in. And Yeshua went out and departed from the temple. Yeshua went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Okay? So, we see there some key words that were highlighted. We see the disciples' attention was on the temporal riches of the temple and its buildings. But Yeshua is about to reveal to his disciples and the Israelites, and it is of paramount importance we understand when Yeshua departed the temple, he was not just with his disciples. And we'll elaborate on this momentarily. So when Yeshua, as we showed, and when Yeshua went out and departed from the temple and his disciples came, he wasn't just with his disciples. It's of paramount importance we understand. When Yeshua departed the temple, he was not just with his disciples. So we see the disciples, though, because that's who it calls out in Matthew 24, the disciples. We see the disciples' attention was on the temporal riches of the temple and its buildings. And Yeshua is about to reveal to his disciples and the Israelites that the temple will be completely destroyed. Now understand, this has not happened yet. This has not happened yet. No matter what the people that call themselves Jews try to tell you, the temple has not been completely destroyed. The temple has not been destroyed. The temple has been destroyed, but not completely destroyed. As Yeshua will specifically describe it, where there is no stone upon another stone. That's the destruction that he's talking about. We should understand each of the three Gospels now. Get this. We need to understand this. Each of the three Gospel accounts share of Yeshua being shown the temple. In each one, Luke 21, Mark 13, Gospel of Matthew 24. Each of those three Gospels share of Yeshua being shown the temple. Now, in each of the Gospels, this happens when Yeshua leaves the temple. In each of these three Gospels. The Gospel of Mark chapter 13, verse 1, like the Gospel of Matthew 24, verse 1, reference Yeshua's disciples specifically. We just said, and his disciples. And one of the disciples, it says in the Gospel of Mark. So it addresses his disciples specifically. But in Luke chapter 21, verse 5, it shares, once he leaves the temple, it says, some spake of the temple. Some spake of the temple. So allow us to grow from just knowing to understanding who are the some, because it doesn't address his disciples in the Gospel of Luke chapter 21. The some in the Gospel of Luke chapter 21, verse 5, it includes Israelites that followed Yeshua from inside the temple where he had been teaching, as well as Yeshua's disciples that are clearly identified specifically in the Gospels of Mark 13 and Matthew 24. So remember, we said this, that remember, when Yeshua departs from the temple, he's not just with his disciples. Yeshua had been teaching in the temple. And the scripture shares on numerous occasions that Yeshua was followed and sought after by the Israelites, especially after his teachings. So it's not hard to believe that there were Israelites that were in the temple where Yeshua was teaching, and once he stopped teaching and departed, that followed Yeshua out of the temple. That's not hard to see, to believe, to imagine. And the some that spake were both Israelites and Yeshua's disciples. So the Gospel of Luke is actually talking about all the people, because there were several people. Again, you can imagine in a crowd, nobody has the voice. Everybody's just shouting out. So those Israelites that followed him out of the temple, as well as his disciples, and then there was one disciple in specific it talks about in Mark. I mean, they all were saying, hey, look at the temple. They all had the same mindset. Just so we're clear on this, there is no discrepancies in the Scripture. Now, Yeshua starts off attempting to get the disciples to see past the temporary riches of the temple and into the future in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 2. So Yeshua is starting off attempting to get the disciples to see past the temporal riches of the temple and into the future in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew chapter 24, verse 2. So let us read. Okay, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 2 reads, and Yeshua said, this is Yeshua speaking, and Yeshua said unto them, and we know this is the disciples because we already said the disciples came unto him, but he's speaking to everyone at the same time because they're outside the temple. But Yeshua said unto them, see ye not all these things? Notice things is underlined there. See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, now get what he's saying about the destruction. There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So now notice, Yeshua is basically telling them about the destruction he's talking about. There will not be one stone upon another. Now, in this passage of Scripture, the Messiah, the Word, shares with his disciples and the Israelites, because remember, they were all there when they're showing him the temple. So, the Messiah, the Word shares with his disciples and the Israelites that the buildings of the temple they were so infatuated with would be completely destroyed. And that the destruction of the buildings of the temple will be such that there will not be one stone upon another. So again, like we said, this has not happened yet. Yet a temple was partially destroyed, but it has not been destroyed the way Yeshua identified it. So this time has not come that Yeshua was telling them about. As much as some people may want to try to make it happen, it hasn't come yet. So let's move from just knowing to understanding that the temple Yeshua is referring to is referenced as things. Remember, we showed that word underlined, things. That word things is underlined. So the temple Yeshua is referring to is referenced as things in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 2, plural. Not just the thing, it's things, plural, which included the actual city of Jerusalem, not just the temple. So again, we want to grow from just knowing and understanding. They weren't just looking at the temple, even though it said that at the time the temple actually had gold and silver actually embedded into the temple. But again, they're not just focusing on the temple, but it includes the actual city of Jerusalem that they're saying, look at these, look at the temple. It's like, look at the temple with all the city. Look how grand it looks. So allow us to grow from just knowing and understanding things represent the temple. I'm not just making this up. As well as what does the temple represent. So that's where we're going to really determine things is representing the temple. Because we're going to move from just knowing to understanding what does the temple represent. Now, the Vine's Expository Dictionary definition of temple, small t, is just the definition, signifying the entire building with its precincts or some part thereof. So signifying the entire building's temple, small t, with its precincts, with other buildings, or some part thereof, as distinct from naos, the inner sanctuary. That's the definition. So let's understand the distinction of the naos, the inner sanctuary. The Vine's Expository Dictionary definition of naos, the inner sanctuary, is this: among the Jews, the sanctuary in the temple, capital T, into which, this capital T temple, into which only the priests could lawfully enter. And it gives examples in the Gospel of Luke 1:9, 1:21 and 22. Christ, the Mashiach, as being of the tribe of Judah, and thus not being a priest while upon the earth, did not enter the temple, capital T. He never entered the temple, capital T. So Yeshua is addressing the destruction of the temple with its precincts, buildings, plural. That's how we know things is what he's talking about in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 2. One last thing to note on this. This is good just to have something to put in your tool belt. The Companion Bible expounds on the word temple. It shares that there are two definitions of the word temple. The word temple with a capital T in the scripture is actually naos, the inner sanctuary where only the priest could lawfully enter. And temple with small t in the scripture is Herion, signifying the entire building with its precincts or some part thereof. That's what they're talking about in the Gospels of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. The entire building with its precincts or some part thereof. Just FYI for you to know. Okay, everybody good? All right. Yeshua makes this same statement about the temple in the Gospels of Luke 21 and Mark 13 and Matthew 24. So he says the same thing about the temple, about it's going to be destroyed where there's not one stone upon another. But now get this. This is where we're going to start to dig in a little bit. This is where it gets real interesting. And after Yeshua makes this statement, after he said that, he's asked two questions in the Gospels of Luke 21 and Mark 13, but he's asked three questions in the Gospel of Matthew 24. So, in the Gospel of Luke chapter 21, verse 7, Yeshua is asked two questions. First question, when shall these things be? Second question, what sign will there be when these things that he just talked about the temple being destroyed, shall come to pass? Those were the two questions. And remember, this is the Gospel of Luke. This is to the Israelites, basically. This is the Israelites he's getting ready to respond to. That was that first one we talked about the three different vantage points. So the first vantage point he's going to give to the Israelites in Luke 21. Now, in the game, Yeshua's asked two questions as well. It says the first question, when shall these things be? The same as the Gospel of Luke 21:7. The second question, very slightly different. What shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? So, again, similar question, just worded a little different than the Luke 21:7 question. It says, what will be the sign? So what will be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled, when they'll actually have been completed? So same thing as Luke 21:7. But now get this. In the Gospel of Matthew 24, verse 3, Yeshua is asked three questions. The only one he's asked, three questions. The other two, only two questions. This third one, three questions. So the first question, same as Luke 21:7 and Mark 13:4. When shall these things be? But now get the second question. What shall be the sign of thy coming? They're not worried about the buildings being fall. They said, what should be the sign? The other two were saying, what will be the sign when these things shall come to pass? What will be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled? The Gospel of Matthew 24 says, what shall be the sign of thy coming, Yeshua, when you're coming back? And the third question in line with that, what shall be the sign of the end of the world? Get this distinction. Different from the other two. The questions other than the first, the second and third, totally different. Okay. As we identified earlier, our previous understanding of the meaning of numbers in Scripture will assist us in building on our understanding of the end-of-the-age prophecy. Now remember, we highlighted only 3 of the 4 Gospels address the end-of-the-age prophecy. Of the 3, only the Matthew 24, chapter 24 account has 3 questions asked. Remember, the number 3 stands for spiritual completion. So this gives us insight that the Gospel of Matthew 24 account is about the completion or the ending of the age, the ending of the end-of-the-age prophecy. The Gospel of Matthew 24 account is about the completion or the ending, the last phase of the end-of-the-age prophecy. Scripture is sharing this with us if we understand and if we're paying attention. So also note, unlike the Gospel of Luke 21:7 and the Gospel of Mark 13:4, the second question is not about the sign of when the buildings or temples will be completely destroyed. They move beyond that, but about when Yeshua will return. Likewise, the third question is about the signs of the end of the world. They're like, okay, so we need to know when the end of the world is coming. Okay? So, let us read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 23, verse 3 and 4. So, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 23, verse 3, it reads, "And as he, Yeshua, sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? Question 1. And what shall be the sign of thy coming? Question 2. And of the end of the world. Question 3. Okay? All right. So let us pause here for a second and just deal with these. Now remember, the first thing we want to call out is that it says that Yeshua is speaking to all of the disciples here. Okay? Notice that. It says, and he's speaking to the disciples. Now remember, we said in the Gospel of Mark 13, he's only speaking to the 4 disciples, Peter, Andrew, John, and Simon. He's only speaking to those 4. So here it's clear that he says that he's upon the Mount of Olives and he's speaking to the disciples. And we know that this has to be different because the questions were different when he was speaking to the 4 versus all the disciples. So again, understand these nuances. They're different. They're not all the same. Again, the perception is that we see the Gospels, they're all the same. There are some things that are the same, but there are other things that are not the same. We're calling these things out. They're not the same. There's no way you can make them be the same. The number of questions are different. The audience is different. Okay? So these are the things I want us to be able to put in our tool belt and have so we can pay attention to. So we're so blessed that Yeshua answered their questions in each of the 3 Gospels because all Scripture is profitable. So we're blessed that Yeshua answered their questions in each of the 3 Gospels. His answers were for his believers then and now, that we might know generally when Yeshua will return and when is the end of this second earth age. It should not come upon the believers as a surprise. That's why he's telling us. He's not going into all of this detail that we're going to get into, sharing with us so that we'll still be walking around unaware of what's going on in the world. He does not want this to come upon you as a surprise. The first question asked in each of the Gospels is exactly the same. Okay? When shall these things be? And Yeshua answers this, and Yeshua shares the answer to the Gospel of Matthew 24, verse 3, that very first question, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 14. Okay? So, Yeshua starts off answering the first question in the Gospel of Matthew chapter he starts off answering the first question that's asked in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 5, to all his disciples, by warning not to be deceived, and of false prophets. So the very first thing that he's warning of to all is not to be deceived. So let us read now the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 and 5. So the Gospel of Matthew chapter 23, verse 4 reads, and Yeshua answered, as they asked that first question, to the first question, and when should these things be? And Yeshua answered and said unto them, take heed. That blinking light should be flashing in your head. Take heed that no man deceive you. Take heed that no man deceive you. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 5. For many men, because he said, make sure that no man deceive you. He's saying in verse 5, he said, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Messiah, and shall deceive many. I am Mashiach, the Christ, and shall deceive many. Okay? Now, the very first thing Yeshua addresses is deception. Let no man deceive you. That's the very first thing when they ask, when shall these things be? He's saying the very first thing in his response to them is, let no man deceive you. Because other people are going to try to come, and this is what we're talking about, to try to tell you when these things shall be. Other people are going to try to come. The very first thing Yeshua is addressing is deception. So let us consider the deception the Messiah is speaking of by way of an analogy, okay? I'm going to give an analogy here. If we believe in or have faith in something that someone has just told us without investigating it for ourselves, we just have belief and faith in something that someone has just told us and we have not investigated it for ourselves, then we can be deceived. Versus, if we believe in or have faith in something that we've thoroughly researched and have personal knowledge of that concludes to be incorrect, this would be an error. That would just be an error. He's not talking about the error. He says, let no man deceive you. The only way you can be deceived is someone you believe and have faith in something that someone has told you without you investigating it for yourself. That's what he's saying here. The deception Yeshua is speaking of is just believing blindly in information given because of. Now remember, 24 verse 5, he says, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Mashiach the Christ, and shall deceive many. So many are going to come saying, oh yeah, no, I'm the one you should listen to. So the deception Yeshua is speaking of is just believing blindly in information given because of the title or status of the presenter. False prophets is coming from. That's the deception Yeshua is speaking of. Just believing blindly in information given because of the title. Oh, that's Pastor so-and-so, that's Bishop so-and-so. That believing blindly, you have not done any investigating for yourself To see a scripture, support scripture, you just believe blindly because of that person's title or status, it's probably a false prophet is coming from. Instead of examining and questioning what anyone shares, me included. I told you guys what the assignment was, the homework assignment, every week, me included. Instead of examining and questioning what anyone shares concerning the scripture. The scripture addresses this throughout, not to do this. A couple of examples are in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, 1 John chapter 4, verse 1, and the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 15. So let's read through a couple of these. First, we're going to look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, and 1 John 4, 1. So, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 reads, "Study to show thyself approved unto Elohim." Study, don't miss that very first word. Study yourself to show yourself approved unto Elohim. A workman that needeth not to be ashamed, able to rightly dividing the word of truth. You can only do that rightly if you study. 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. "Beloved, believe not every spirit." Don't just believe every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of Elohim. Because many false prophets, it's telling you why. Many false prophets are gone out into the world. It's telling you. The beloved disciple John in 1 John 4:1 corroborates Yeshua's warning of many false prophets are gone out. Remember, in Matthew 24, verse 5, he says, and many shall come in my name. So the beloved disciple John is corroborating Yeshua's warning of many false prophets are gone out into the world. Interestingly, the definition of spirit, and I get this in 1 John 4:1. Again, growing from just knowing to understanding. The definition of spirit, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits. The definition of spirit and spirits in this particular passage of Scripture may surprise you. The Vine's expository definition of this is the definition: those who claim to be depositors of these gifts. That's what spirit and spirits, it means there. The spirit and spirits addressed here have nothing to do with anything spiritual. Have nothing to do with anything spiritual. The spirit and spirits referenced here are the perpetrators. Those who claim to be the perpetrators, those false prophets. So believe not every perpetrator, but try the perpetrators, whether they are of Elohim. Okay, we're going to finish up here with the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 15. So let us read that. This is another example of Yeshua sharing with us that we should not be deceived. We should not let anyone deceive us. So, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 reads, "Enter ye in at the strait gate." That's the instruction. Enter ye in at the strait gate. For wide is the gate. So they're saying there's two gates. So there's a strait gate and there's a wide gate. Enter ye in at the strait gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Go in that wide gate. Many there be which go in that wide gate. Gospel of Matthew chapter 7, 14. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Few there be that find that strait gate. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. Beware of false prophets. That's what Yeshua was warning way back in Matthew chapter 7. We're in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 7, he said, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are raving wolves. Okay? So Yeshua is sharing way back in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7. Yeshua is warning of the perpetrators, false prophets, in the Gospel of Matthew, even before chapter 24. We should not allow anyone to say anything concerning Yahweh Elohim and his word without backing it up scripturally. Okay, let me just bear with me one more second, okay? I want to just share with you guys a couple more verses here. So we should not allow anyone to say anything concerning Yahweh Elohim and his word without backing it up scripturally. So this will keep us from being deceived. Okay? So let us read now 2 John chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Let us just read this real quick, and we'll get ready to wrap up here. Okay, so 2 John chapter 1, verse 9. Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Mashiach, the Christ. So anyone who transgresseth and abideth not, they don't abide in the doctrine of Mashiach, Christ, hath not Elohim. They don't have Elohim. He that abideth in the doctrine of Mashiach, Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. 2 John chapter 1, verse 10. If there come any unto you, and bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your house, neither bid him Elohim speed. So if someone's coming to you and not bringing you the doctrine of what the scripture is saying, and they change it and twist it, they say, don't even receive him, and don't let him into your house, and don't bid him Elohim speed. 2 John chapter 1, verse 11, he said, because if you do, for he that biddeth him Elohim speed is partaker of his evil deeds. We should understand that this warning from the Messiah is regarding the Antichrist. He is the deceiver and always has been. So let us quickly read the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44. Again, just validating all of this stuff, so we're building layers. Because, again, your assignment is to share with me what you found was incorrect. The Gospel of John chapter 8, verse 44, ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. Ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and get this, and abode not in truth. Perpetrator, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. This cannot be emphasized enough that unless we are continuously equipped with the spiritual armor, we are able to be deceived. Lastly, we're going to read the Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. Revelation 12, 9. And the great dragon, which was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. That's his job from the very beginning. It's deception. So we know who it is. The great dragon, that old serpent, the devil, Hasatan, which deceiveth the whole world, he was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Okay? So again, we see Yeshua's very first warning is for us not to be deceived when he begins answering these questions to his disciples, to all of his disciples. So we're going to pause there for the first class, and we will pick up next week, and we're going to really so we set the stage, but now the pace is going to start picking up, okay? So I'm going to end the recording now,